I've been turning Minecraft's vanilla structures absolutely giant. First, I transformed the jungle temple from looking awful to looking absolutely huge and slightly less awful. And most recently, I transformed a desert pyramid into this giant pyramid which is filled to the brim with deadly traps. Today is my biggest task though, as I'll be transforming a default underwater temple into a gigantic underwater temple, over 380 blocks tall. This is going to be one of the most difficult builds I've ever created for 3 main reasons. One is obviously just the size. The second reason is because of the lack of blocks that I can use. There aren't many prismarine varieties in the game, so we're really going to have to be creative with the palette that we use. And lastly, the terrain is going to be a huge challenge, as we somehow need to make a 380 block tall ocean in a vanilla world. I say we, but I actually asked my friend Freya, who's an expert with using World Painter, to make the terrain for me. He created this huge new biome for me, which I'll put up an image of as it's too big to capture the whole thing in-game. This new biome is named an amplified ocean. It basically consists of huge cliffs that go all around the outside of the biome, leading up to some flat land which is about 320 blocks high. In the center is a huge ocean, which goes all the way from the flat land down to 1 block above the void, leaving a huge amount of height in the ocean for us to use. Now that I've explained that though, let's get to building the temple. Before doing anything, I drained the ocean so it would be easier to build in. I'll add the water back in right at the end. I feel like one of the most defining parts of an underwater temple is the shape. For this build, I'll be splitting the temple into 3 main areas to make it easier to build. I'm starting by building the left side of the temple, which is a long rectangular building. Then I'll work on the back area, and finally I'll finish by working on the central building, which is going to be the tallest. Luckily for me, like most of Minecraft structures, this is fully symmetrical, so I only have to build one half and then I can flip everything over to the other side. I don't know why most of Minecraft structures seem to be symmetrical, but I don't mind at all that they are. Also, like my other mega builds, I've started by building a huge pillar. From there, I can then just attach some walls and flip everything over to create the base shape. Building in this method makes it a lot easier to create these huge buildings, and saves me having to make a plan. I didn't actually have a plan for this build at all. My only reference I looked at while building this was the default build. As you can tell by now, to make the palette slightly less boring and not just prismarine varieties, I also mixed in a few other builds which I felt blended in nicely. These included warped planks, stripped logs and dried kelp blocks. I also used a load of diamond ores. Normally I'd avoid using super rare blocks like diamonds in a survival friendly world. However, the entire idea of this build is meant to be that it's a very, very rare structure that spawns in a biome that most seeds don't even include. If you found this, you'd basically never need to mine again. I think having super rare builds in the game like this would be a lot of fun, even if this might be a tiny bit overboard with the size. Like usual, I asked my friend Cloris to create some huge statues which I could incorporate into the temple. He sent me this really cool guardian statue, which blends in perfectly and adds a lot of colour. He also sent me some other cool organics, including some giant fish we'll add at the end, so stay tuned. Once the statue was in place, I just added a support under it to hold it in place so that it's not floating. With all the walls in place, I then moved upwards. A regular underwater temple has a bunch of singular blocks placed all around the roof, and so I wanted to do something similar, but because of the bigger scale, I instead chose to add a bunch of round buildings all along the top. These would have sea lanterns inside of them, which should help to add light to the building once it's underwater. I then moved the centre of the roof, and built another raised platform with a larger domed building on top. This would just help to add some extra height variety to the building. I stacked this design all along the rooftop to make it look more organised, and I really like how this area ended up looking. The roof is still pretty bland and has a lot of dark prismarine. However, later on, once all the exterior is done, I'll be going back and adding in some other blocks to add some nice gradients. I then rotated the area that I just made to form the back section of the temple. On top of this, I added in some really thick arches which took a really long time to shape. These are just reminiscent of the arches on the back of a default underwater temple, which most people won't see anyway and probably didn't even know were there. Apologies for the chunks being a bit buggy here. but I then worked on flipping the entire build onto the other side to create an upside down U shape. In the center, I began building up the grand entranceway. To start with, I just made some really simple patterns on the wall and formed a general shape. I wanted to make sure that the proportions of the building looked correct before I committed to adding any details. For the details, I added a huge open area in the center where we'll be putting a statue in a moment. I also then added some grand pillars coming down from the rooftop and some arches along the bottom. Finally, I added in a ton of windows which are all framed really nicely with a lot of triangular shapes which are also reminiscent of default underwater temples. On either side of the rooftop, I added a couple more domed roofs on some slightly raised up areas and added some basic pillars along the side of the central area. I then copied this design along the front and added in a really cool central design which will look great on top of the statue. Talking about the statue, I then placed it in. It's a huge guardian statue with a slightly metallic look. It looks so imposing above the entrance and would make me very scared to enter the temple. And now, moving right to the top of the temple, I created a small area just to top the entire building off. I built a sort of aqueduct around the outside of a domed building. This will be positioned just above the water level, sticking out of the ocean so that we can get all the way to the build height limit. This would also help players locate the temple, so they can plan out how they want to enter. Moving back down to the bottom of the ocean, I worked on building a grand entranceway to the temple. I just marked out a huge doorway and then built a staircase coming down from it. As you can see, the build is starting to look very complete. As one of the final finishing touches of the exterior though, I built some arches coming along the front connecting the two sides together, and I gave these a sort of tentacle look with a lot of ridges. To help light this central area up at nighttime, I then added a couple of hanging lights coming down from the arches. As I spoke about earlier, I then moved on to adding some more texturing. Along the roof, I mixed a lot of copper in with this dark prismarine to make it look like the build is rusting over time. This just helps to make it look a lot more aquatic and realistic. I also added a bunch of warped mushrooms to make the transition from copper to dark prismarine more smooth. Once this is underwater though, I'll switch the mushrooms to coral. If I placed coral right now though, it would just go grey as it needs water to survive. I also added some other blocks into the walls, mixing lodestones in with the main pillars, and some tuff into the main walls. I also mixed some cyan concrete in with some of the walls along the main entrance, which just makes the colour scheme pop, and the build stand out even more. From here, I then added a bunch of lights all along the build so that it will stand out more underwater, framing the key shapes and arches. To finish the exterior, I added in a grand pathway which leads up to the temple, with a lot of path tiles that look very aged and worn out. And with that, the exterior was finished. We still need to work on adding more of an atmosphere around the build with some coral, seaweed, fish and terraforming. However, first I wanted to get the interior finished. The interior isn't going to be as big or elaborate as we've done in the past. However, it's still going to be pretty cool. First of all, I emptied out an area in the center of the temple. I then decorated the walls with a pretty simple design. This room has two heights, a slightly raised path and then a lower area where loot will be located. Along the roof of the building, I added some sea lanterns in a circular kind of design, which fits in well with the spears of light that are along the path. In the center of the room, I then added in a bunch of coal ores. My idea for the layout of this temple is basically that there will be a lot of loot rooms, and the further in that you can venture, the rarer that the ores will become. With the room completed, I then added in some lighting to make it very ambient, and lots of tubes in the wall. Only one of these pathways will lead you to the next room though, kind of like a maze that you have to swim through. For the loot rooms, I thought I'd use the same design for each room to make the temple very disorienting, so that you forget which rooms you've already explored and which pathway leads to the exit. For the design of the room, I kept it similar to the main room, but much smaller with a chandelier in the center. Once the room is fully submerged in water, it should be quite claustrophobic inside. Considering it will also be filled with Elder Guardians, it should be very difficult to navigate as well. Finally, I filled up the rooms with rarer ores like gold, diamonds, emeralds and finally netherite in the furthest away chamber. And now to finish the build, I just had a tiny bit of work to do for the landscape around it. Freya left the entire ocean completely flat for me, so I'd be able to build the temple more easily, but now I'd have to build the terrain. I just created some basic hills all around it with a bunch of rocks. For the rocks, I just used emerald blocks as a placeholder and then switched them to a bunch of different blocks, like mossy cobblestone and tuff. To add some life to the area, I then built a bunch of pieces of seaweed in a variety of heights, starting with smaller pieces and then a couple of extra tall pieces of seaweed to place more around the edges of the seabed. I also made a couple of pieces of coral which will help to add colour. With these finished, I then pasted them all around the ocean in clusters, which helps to fill the space perfectly. Finally, I added in some fish that Cloris designed to add extra life to the build. These look spectacular and tie everything together perfectly. He even made some huge sharks who are there to help protect the temple. And with that, we were finished. If this video manages to reach 2,500 likes, I'll post the download for free in my Discord. So make sure to leave a like and a comment as it really helps to support the channel. I'll leave a link to join my Discord in a pinned comment. Thank you so much for watching. I have a huge project I'll be posting soon, so please make sure to subscribe, and goodbye.